light for you in dark places when all other lights go out.
Hello everyone, this is DCHL Devin here, and welcome to another episode of Light in the Dark. And today I'm going to do a how to play video on a scenario. This is a little different from my usual faction videos. These are just going to interject in between. I figure I'll do all 12 scenarios as I'm still learning to play each and every faction. Unfortunately, it does take a little while to get through every variation of all 43 factions in the game, so this is probably a good way to break things up. A lot of players ask, how do I play certain scenarios? But unfortunately, even for the most expert players, this is a very difficult question to answer. The reason is because this depends on your opponent's army, your opponent's play style, your army, the terrain, how big the table is, how much time you have, etc. Like, it's just a lot. There's a lot of different little details. So I'm going to have to make some general assumptions here before I even begin this video. And then what I'm going to try to do is cover as many of those variations in general advice that works for most lists. So what are my assumptions? My assumptions are we're playing an 800-point game. Now, for the most part, this game scales pretty much the same depending on what point level you're at. The armies kind of get smaller or larger, but just assume for the purpose of this, 800 points. It's going to be on 4x4 tables. There's some tables that are a little larger, like at Throne of Skulls. It is a 4x6 table, so that skews this advice a little bit. And then there's some that are even smaller, 4x3s, or you might see in Canada events that I've been to. Both of those are pretty rare, 4x4s being the average in the game. Moderate GW terrain, so I'm going to assume you're not playing it on a fancy Nova Open style terrain boards. This is more your Articon style tables with generic GW produced terrain, the forests and such that they normally typically make in the buildings. So, and this is going to assume a 2-hour healthy time limit. So you don't have too little time, you don't have too much time. So with those assumptions out of the way, let's get into our first scenario, and that is Domination. This is the first one of the 12 in the main rulebook, and Domination will be one that you most likely will play in every single tournament. So, scenario highlights. Let's go ahead and go over the scenario a little bit. First off, you deploy on a board half, so you have the entire half of the board to yourself. You can deploy anywhere within there, no restrictions, and your opponent can do the same on his half. The 25% ending condition, this is important because that means the game ends when you want it to end. This is a huge thing to factor in. An ending condition is something that you should definitely pay attention to. 2 points for each objective, but only 1 point if you have models on it. I'm sorry, if your opponent has models on it. So let's say within 3 inches of the objective, you have 2 models, your opponent has 1, you get 1 point rather than 2 for this victory condition. And 1 point for the enemy leader wounding him, not killing him. So just note that you don't have to actually take him out. And also 1 point for breaking the opposing army. So there's an obvious heavy emphasis on capturing objectives in this game. Own 3 objectives, and that is all you need to win. That is something important to note. If you have 3 objectives full clear, then that means you'll have 6 points, and your opponent cannot possibly get to 6 without accomplishing breaking you, killing your leader, and capturing 2 objectives free and clear without himself either being broken or having a wound on his leader. I'm sorry, so wounding your leader. This makes the game very, very difficult to win for your opponent. So just remember that. You don't need to get all 5. You just have to get 3. And in most tournaments, you're often going to find that tournament points are going to weigh more heavily than victory points. Victory points are just a tiebreaker. So all you want to do is win the scenario, if at the very least. You're not trying to necessarily get max VPs in order to get into the podium placements. Of course, getting more VPs is better. Of course, you are going to want to focus on major wins if the tournament is broken up in major, minor win kind of scenarios. In this case, you're going to want to win by at least 3 points. For that, you still don't need all 5 objectives. You just need to do some area denial. So take your 3 objectives. You want to capture those free and clear. Maybe break, maybe wound the hero for the opposing side, but more importantly, you want to get at least 1 model within 3 inches of their objectives. That will reduce their score by 1 point for each objective which you did that. It makes it, once again, impossible for the opponent to win the game in that sense. So just remember that you don't need to capture all 5. It's nice if you get all 5, get the 12 VPs if you can, but you don't have to. You just want to win. So let's go into the general advice on placing these objectives. So you place the objectives in this where it's anywhere on the board, but it has to be 12 inches from another objective and 6 inches from a board edge. That 12 inches from another objective is a huge key factor. What that means is you can create area denial for another objective if your opponent needs it in a certain place. So let's say we both roll the dice and I have to place the first objective. And I notice across the field that you have wood elves. Well, I don't want the objectives being in the woods, especially if I'm playing Rohan where I need it out in the open. So what you can do is place the objective right next to woods, all right? So not necessarily bordering it, but in a way where the 12-inch range of the objective covers the entire woodland. If you can get two of them, then even more perfect. That means your opponent cannot place his objective in the woods where he gets full advantage for the objective. This is also important where you're going to want to place objectives out of line of sight if your opponent is a high-shooting army. If there's a big building, then it would be a good idea to put it on one side of the building. Yes, you don't know what half of the table you're going to go on, but assuming you get the half you want, you can make sure that you have cover from ranged firepower. Remember, if you put things in a fortress like an objective, that means you have to invade that fortress if the opponent swaps table halves on you. So it's not necessarily a good idea to encompass the objective in all sorts of terrain where it's easily defended if you don't have something that can easily assault that terrain. So if you have a dragon that can breathe fire into it, great. But if you have a bunch of hobbits, probably not. So you don't want to make it too difficult for yourself, especially if you're already on the losing end. This obviously works in reverse if you are those factions. So if you find that you are elves and you have woodlands, you want to place it in the woods so that way your opponent has to go in there. This is great if they have fell beasts and such that can't actually get into the forest to come and attack you. The next thing you're going to want is to consider the aggressiveness of you and your opponent. If your army is highly aggressive and you know you're going to be on their side of the field, which more often than not in this scenario you're going to do, then you're going to want to start to place objectives kind of more in the middle or toward maybe-ish your opponent's side. You can, of course, do it in reverse. If you get more of the objectives on your side, then basically you're just pushing them away from the objective. This depends on how many models you have. But if you have very, very few models, it often can be a little more advantageous to place more objectives in a concentrated area where you can at least attempt to get all of them in a short period of time. With that, what that would mean is, let's say I place an objective first, I place one on my side, then my opponent places one on his side, and then I decide to place one, once again, maybe in the middle-ish of the board, and then my opponent then once again places his on his side. So now there's like one in the middle, one on my side, and then two on my opponent's side. I then take my third objective and place it on my opponent's board half, if possible, depending on how things are spaced out. What that does is it means you don't have to stretch back going far back away to go get that last objective. And even better, because more of the objectives are on one side, you can flip the table and make it where you start on the other side. This can work to your advantage depending on the composition of your force and how aggressive you're going to be. So just keep that in mind. Also on the note of table swapping sides, just remember, don't automatically place everything on your end because the opponent can pull some tricks like I just mentioned. And remember, you do not know what table half you're going to be on. Now, if you want to throw off your opponent on the table halves, what you can do is put the table sideways. Now, this at first will be very jarring to a lot of newer opponents. They're actually going to wonder if you can even do that. But you can. The board simply has not actually been placed into a table half yet. You don't know what your deployment zone is yet. And so when you're done placing all the objectives, play the game where the table half splits up and down the board. So you're actually deploying your army sideways. This can really throw off an opponent. Not only are you playing the game where they're psychologically disrupted by you kind of throwing their perspective all out of whack, but you can actually make sure that you get most of the objectives on your table half and push them off on the other one, and they won't see it coming. So that's just something to note. Most TOs will go in favor of it because nothing about the scenario says that you have to play with me on one side of the table and you on another side of the table. You can play sideways. So that's just something to note. Otherwise, that's pretty much it as far as objective placing. A lot of this is going to be a little bit of instinct, but just note how aggressive you're going to be and where you think you're going to be by the end of the game. So let's go into small, medium, and large size armies. The tactics are going to be a little bit different depending on the size of your force. And so what do I mean by small? Small armies are 2 to 20 models. No, or 1 if you're playing Smaug, but honestly, Smaug's kind of a whole different playing style, and a lot of tournaments tend to ban him. So let's say 2 to 20, and maybe 3 to 20 if we account for model minimums like that are common in American tournaments. But if you're in the GBHL, you probably don't have model minimums in that case. So first, I would say play the game as if you're just simply playing to the death. Just assault your opponent. Don't even worry about the objectives. Just try to destroy as much of your opponent as possible, especially if they have a horde force or a much larger force than you, maybe double the amount of models. The reason you're going to want to do this is because you want to stay together. The more you break off someone to go do this, go do that, then you have now weakened your force. Now, there are exceptions to this. Let's say I'm playing a ranger army and I happen to have Fetty Bolger. Well, he's not going to help me very much, so his job is to go run to an objective. Sometimes you're going to have guys like that. Maybe you throw in 3 random orc trackers in your mortar force. They're not going to help too much, so sure, go run them back toward an objective and let them stay there. This is a little bit more helpful if it's a bodyguard unit, maybe a single outrider or something like that, but otherwise, if your army is meant to stay cohesive as a force, keep it together. Don't break apart until your opponent's force is broken. The game ends at 25%. You have plenty of time. The more your opponent ignores this advice and starts splitting his army up, the less of his army you have to fight to break him. And once an opponent's force is broken, a lot of times they're going to start to run. Now, of course, things will keep them from running, and you want to stop that. So aim for generals, all right? Not only is this a point, but generally generals are going to be like heroes of legend that'll auto-stand fast and keep them around. And also aim for things like shamans, anything that are courage buffs, war horns, shield bearers, anything that continues to improve their army's chances of sticking around. You can win a scenario by the opponent failing to stay in play after he's broken. Let's say he ran a single model out to an objective. If he breaks runs, he loses that objective. He might find himself pressured to send more toward that objective. Great, that's more you are destroying because he's abandoning his core force. So this is pretty much how you're going to want to play it for the most part with a small force. Only split apart on the last turn or two. You're going to have to calculate how far you are from objectives and how many turns it's going to take to get there. You should, on average, account for about 10 to 15 minutes per turn. All right, now that sounds like a lot, but your opponent could possibly slow play you. You're going to want to watch for slow play. So you're going to want to count in about 15 minutes, I like to. So if I have 30 minutes left in the game, I know I'm only going to get 2 turns left. Now, you might get more if you know how to rush your opponent. Talk about that in a totally separate video. But just factor in an overwhelming amount of time that you're going to need. And that will give you the time to get there. This is why, once again, I often like to concentrate the objectives as much as possible. So that way I don't have to go far to get to them. So, I mean, otherwise you can use slingshots. You can factor that in. Sometimes you can, and a slingshot, by the way, is a technical term I use to describe using a heroic combat to move again. So you see an objective on the other side of the field, and you know you're only get 1 or 2 turns left. Great. Throw a hero into combat, especially if he's on a horse, and then use a heroic combat and bounce your guys all over the place. Now you only need 1 turn to get to the objective. It allows you to kind of speed things up. Medium armies. So let's say your army is about 30 to 50 models at 800 points. This is what I class as kind of the overall average on most armies in the game. For the most part, I would still play the game like to the death. Ignore the objectives at first. Of course, using outlier units, like I mentioned earlier, to go grab those objectives, but ignore the objectives and just focus on slaughtering your opponent. If your opponent is slaughtered and they're broken, then chances are they're going to run off objectives and they're going to, you're going to get those victory points, but also they're going to have less models to tie you up with. So you really, really want to make sure you just kind of like spend the first hour just not even caring. Just slaughter the opponent. Block off areas of the field if you can. If your opponent happens to be a little bit smaller, maybe you can start to swing the battle where you can block your opponent from getting to certain sections. A little easier with terrain in the way and such like that, but try to engage quickly. If you're fighting a superior force, then prepare to win by suicide. The beauty about the game ending at 25% means you can suicide to win against your opponent. What does that mean? That means that you can end up breaking and quartering yourself, all right, when your army or models are already on the objectives and your opponent is not, and your opponent doesn't have enough time to get to them. It's an artificial way to end the game before the 2-hour time limit that your opponent may not factor in. You can only do this when the game ends at 25%. You can't do this when the game ends at 50% because you got to do random roll-offs in order to do it. So, well, it's a little harder to do. It's a lot less reliable in this case. So what you can do is, if you notice your opponent is blocked off objectives, but your opponent is going to slaughter you quickly, block them from the objectives, and then get one model on there that's maybe like a bodyguard unit. Don't use an outlier. Use a hero or something that will reliably stay on, and then do everything in your power to suicide to win. You have to do this carefully. But I would piercing strike everywhere, feint to lose combat, use banner rerolls to reroll your successful dice to win, everything in order to crush yourself and make your opponent bleed you out. Now, you're going to have to do this artfully for two reasons. One, if you miscalculate this, then you're going to break yourself and lose the game faster than you would have expected. Like, your opponent's going to be able to run toward those objectives that you hold. So you have to calculate this within your army. How likely is your army to keep harassing them even after you're broken? The second thing you want to calculate this for is because if you don't do it right, then your opponent will start to notice it, and he'll start shielding. He'll start shielding, he'll start barging, and he'll start doing actions where he doesn't require himself to kill you. He'll give himself time to get to the objectives. So you only want to do this trick and factor in this trick if you know you have an inferior force. I know I did this once when I had an army that was all Courage 2, didn't really have any shamans, and I had to fight Men of the Dead. I'm going to die. And so basically, I let my army die in such a way where I was on the objectives with heroes who were reliable models, and then my opponent 25%ed me, couldn't get to the objectives. You should also, once again, plan about 15 minutes per turn. This time I would not say 10 to 15, it should be 15, because if you have a normal size force, your opponent has a normal size force, there's going to be a lot of thinking involved. And with these size armies, it is easier to slow play legally, and what that essentially means is I can sit there and think about something and, you know, move something, move another one another way, and be like, oh, can I take that back? You know, little different tricks like that. Once again, another video, I'll cover slow playing and how to defeat that. And also, if you're an army that sits back and shoots a lot, try to avoid doing that too much if you don't have most of the objectives on your side. Because if you have to factor in 15 minutes per turn, to travel a 48-inch board with a 6-inch moving army is going to take you well over an hour. That doesn't sound right until you actually try to do it and your opponent is harassing you and you have to do all this fighting and these combats and the shoot. It's going to take forever. So just note that if you're going to be a shooting army, factor in only a couple turns of shooting and then start moving toward where you need to go. Make sure you have models on that objective. This is a lot easier to do when you have a couple cav models sprinkled in. So let's say you have a Harad force and 50% of your army is bows, so you're going to want to sit back and shoot with the Betrayer. Well, put in some Haradrim Raiders, most specifically maybe Serpent Riders, in order to go out and spread to get to the objective, so that way you don't have to worry about moving your whole force there. Large armies have the most advantage. You're talking about 50 plus models. You have so much advantage because it's easy to suicide to win this scenario. It's also easy to just obliterate your opponent. I would honestly just focus fire on just crashing right into your opponent. Depends. Let's say you're Goblin Town. It's so much better to just play aggressive. If you're a different horde like Hobbits, then you're not going to be able to play aggressive. You're going to have to play defensive, shoot as much as possible, and then once again use faster units to get to the objectives. But overall, you still have the advantage in the scenario. And you should watch out for slow play if you're fighting a larger army, but if you are the larger army, then you should watch for slow playing yourself. Sometimes you might not give yourself enough time to get to an objective because you move too slow on your entire army. So just really watch that clock in that case. If you happen to be playing an army that is extremely defensive and also has high courage, like Dwarves or Men of the Dead, then it's going to look a little bit harder. They're going to almost act like a horde army because the way they operate, if they're super aggressive and then they don't leave when they're broken, they're going to almost act in that manner. But, I mean, playing a horde, just be aggressive, shove yourself right into them, and remember, you only need 3 objectives to win. So, if you suicide to win, note that you are giving your opponent a point. All right, so just protect your general at all costs. Try to prevent him from getting wounded. If your general gets wounded, then note that your opponent can tie you. So you're going to have to make sure not only do you have those 3 objectives, but you have to make sure one of the opponent's objectives at least have a model on there. You won't get a major win, but it is a way to win. So anyway, guys, hopefully that's maybe as much information I can give in a general overall perspective of how to win domination. Let me know if you guys like this style video, and if you want me to do anything different on the future videos as far as the different scenarios, I will go through all 12. And I will talk to you all very soon.